this kind invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. So this is the book, and I have to say that the book is a little bit dark. Maybe the most colorful part of this book is the cover. And I have to basically thank the Cornell for basically getting this like very colorful image for the cover. And this is basically the image of the Sheikh Ali's temple in Lalish in Iraq. So this is basically the famous snake next to the main temple entrance. It's obviously the most important place for the Yezidis in the world. So the main question I try to answer in this book is basically when we think about the religious diversity, not only in the Muslim societies, but also in different parts of the world, how can we make sense of the circumstances under which this diversity is basically maintained, and then the circumstances under which it is basically being threatened and basically end up collapsing? And in the book, I talk about two different big cases. The first case now I'm going to focus on, which is basically the case of the Yezidis in Iraq. And the second case, which is I'm not going to talk about, but I will be happy to answer your questions about that. It is basically the case of the Alevis in Turkey, with a primary focus on the late 20th and early 21st century. But then the book basically talks about other groups like the Baha'is in Iran, the Ahmadis in Indonesia and Pakistan. So what I try to basically is to kind of really come up with a conceptual framework that may help us to make sense of why certain groups are being targeted more than others in different societies. So the bigger debate I'm engaging with, and it's kind of simplistic in a sense, but I try to make it maybe more nuanced. So the bigger debate is about the role of religion in shaping political behavior with a specific focus on mass violence. So the question many people ask me is, does religion incite mass violence? And I kind of really put two opposing approaches. The first approach, which actually comes from maybe from the Marxist approach, and I put this famous book by Engels, The Peasant Wars in Germany. So from this perspective, even if the rhetoric can be religious, even if the discourse can be religious, it is not about religion. So people are not really motivated by religion, but they are really motivated by power, by self-interest, by more mundane things, and they basically use religion just to kind of justify their actions. So religion is more kind of an instrument in the hands of the politicians or political elites to mobilize masses and to kind of basically cover their real interests. But then if you look at the other side of the debate, and this basically famous book by Richard Dawkins from 2006, The God Delusion, it's a very provocative book, but his main argument is that there is something peculiar about religion which basically incites people to engage in violence. And this is basically a very broad debate, and it has been, you can basically see different versions of the debate in public space. So I try to basically make that debate more manageable, and these are the specific questions I ask. So then, why do some minorities, more than others, provoke the ire of majorities? And obviously I'm focusing on religious minorities because there are different religious minorities, but only some of them actually get attacked. Only some of them became targets of mass violence, while others basically really maintain their coexistence with the majorities. And then the second question is that, could we talk about the religious difference as playing a real role in shaping this violence? So is there something about the religion which basically leads to that kind of violence? So main conceptual contribution of this work is the term liminal minority. For those of you from anthropology, this should not be very a foreign term, because I think the anthropologists used to talk about that term. Victor Turner from the 60s, for example. And then it comes from the Latin word liman, which simply means threshold, in-betweenness, ambiguity. And then there are people who use the term mostly in the theater, in performance studies. But then there are not many people who use the term, at least in the field I'm studying, which is basically political science. So I kind of come up with this term to make sense of the experience of certain religious minorities in different parts of the world, but the book is mostly about the experience of the liminal minorities in Muslim societies. And this is the kind of the concept, the definition I come up with, and maybe I should read it because it's kind of really central to what I do in this book. So liminal religious minorities are groups whose core religious beliefs and practices remain ambivalent, ill-defined, and stigmatized in the eyes of elite and ordinary members of the dominant group. So the definition has two different dimensions, which is so central to using it. The first one is that, unlike the religions which basically recognize each other, when we talk about the liminal minorities, we are talking about religions which are not properly recognized as religions by the dominant majority. So in that sense, the representatives of the dominant religion do not typically think of liminal groups as being a proper religion. So they basically do not offer the theological recognition to those religions. I mean, think about the Abrahamic religions, the Judaism, Islam, Christianity. I mean, obviously, there are lots of different elements of disagreement and antagonism, but at the end of the day, you can talk about a clear theological recognition of these religions of each other. But then when we talk about the focus on the liminal groups, it is not the case. So for example, since I'm going to talk about the Yezidis mostly today, for mainstream Muslim perspectives, Yezidism is not a proper religion. So there are different interpretations. For some people, it used to be a corrupt version of the Sufism, in the sense that the religion was established back in the 13th century, but then it kind of really corrupted some of the teachings of the Sheikh Adi, which is typically described as the founder of Yezidism. So from this perspective, it is not like a proper religion, and then it can be a proper religion because there can be no religion after Islam itself. So it can be more like a heretical, like a belief system. It can be a political movement, but it is definitely not receiving any kind of theological recognition from the Muslim authorities. And again, the classical example is the millet system. If you look at basically how the millet system worked in the Ottoman Empire since the 16th century, obviously Yezidis were not part of the millet system. Second dimension is also very important, equally important. So my argument is that when we look at how the liminal groups are pursued by the members of the majority, we basically see these layers of stigmas associated with the religious beliefs. So in the most maybe classical example, from the perspective of the many Muslims, and I mean that perspective was also adopted by some Westerners throughout the 20th century, Yezidis were devil worshippers, and simply because they worship peacock angel, which is so central to Yezidi religion. But from the Muslim perspective, it is the same angel, which is Iblis, devil. So once they basically make this association, then the devil became the central figure for Yezidism, and the Yezidis became devil worshippers. So it's basically kind of a stigma, because then if you perceive the Yezidis as being devil worshippers, it also means that you don't basically think that they are having a proper religion. Another kind of common stigma I find in many different sources is that, and it's not only unique to Yezidis, but you can actually find it for other groups, also for Alevis. The argument is that, or the perception is that, when Yezidis have their own rituals, religious rituals, they also engage in sexually illicit practices. So one common accusation by Muslim clerics is that they basically have their own wives, sisters, girls given to the sheikhs, because it's basically how they kind of practice their religion. I mean, it's obviously complete falsehood, but then there has been lots of different sources kind of making that claim, either implicit or explicit, throughout the history. And you can also find the same claim against the Alevis, but also for Baha'is, and also for some Christians, the different Christian groups back in the early modern Europe. So once you basically have these two dimensions, lacking theological recognition from the dominant religion, plus stigmatization, the argument is that there's a potential for violence in this kind of relationship. It doesn't mean that, and it's not a simplistic argument, in the sense that the members of the majority always target the minority, but that basically creates this kind of a potential for violence, which may actually end up targeting the minority under certain political circumstances. Yeah, please.
Yeah. What type of violence are you referring to? Is it physical violence or non-verbal violence?
Yes, I mean, I'm primarily focusing on the physical violence here, but then obviously violence comes in different shapes. I mean, this can be a violence by itself if you think about the symbolic violence, but I'm primarily interested in episodes of bottom-up violence, like mass violence targeting the religious groups. So, and it will be clear because the particular historical episode I'm going to talk is going to be 2014, when the Yazidis were targeted by the IS, the self-styled Islamic State, in Sinjar in northern Iraq, just basically 10 years ago. So, yeah. So, and I mean, one thing I should add is that the differences are not fixed. So it's kind of it's not like a racial difference in the sense that once you basically have a difference, there's no way you can transcend it. Because from the perspective of the majority, these differences can be actually bridged as long as the members of the minorities are willing to assimilate. So there are like lots of different instances where you can talk about members of the Alevis or members of the Yazidis became Muslims. So as long as they are basically willing to abandon their own faith, they are basically kind of incorporated to the dominant religion. But then, as long as they continue to claim that they are Yazidis and Alevis, this obviously creates tensions. So, I mean, every book has a different kind of history. So the inception for this book came to me back in 2017. I was basically hosting a conference in my previous institution, and there are a couple of Yazidi activists from Germany, and they were basically showing this documentary about what happened in northern Iraq in August 2014. Just to kind of give you a very brief historical background. So what happened is that the self-styled Islamic State, it always emerged in Syria, in Iraq after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It became much more powerful by 2013, and by June 2014, it captured the main city in northern Iraq, which is Mosul. And then 2 months later, early August 2014, almost 10 years ago, they basically targeted the Yazidi homeland, which is basically the Sinjar, the region between the Syria and Iraq. So, what is kind of really, I should not use the word interesting because it's not interesting, but maybe kind of really macabre and kind of makes you really disturbing is that, I mean, obviously IS is a very violent organization. It basically engages on all kind of different types of crimes. But then once you basically look at how it treated the Yazidis, there's something exceptionally brutal about this treatment. So then, I mean, yes, it basically attacked the Shiites, some of the Sunni groups, the Christians, but then the way in which they basically treated the Yazidis were basically a different category. So that basically made me curious of how to make sense of that. And I will basically explain what really makes it exceptionally brutal. And the second thing is that once we basically think about the IS, we used to think about the foreign fighters because there were basically tens of thousands of people from different parts of the world which basically joined the IS. But they were not the people who really attacked the Yazidis. The people who attacked the Yazidis back in 2014 were actually local people. So there were the people who were living with the Yazidis for many generations, and they were primarily Sunni Turkmen and Arabs, and there were actually some Sunni Kurdish tribes which basically participated in that. So then the question becomes, what made people prey, which is basically local people, on their Yazidi neighbors and transform them into looters, enslavers, and murderers? And obviously, I'm not the first person addressing this question because many people who are studying political violence in different contexts address it. Maybe more recently, if you look at the literature on Holocaust, there's more people, like most of the historians, looking at the local relations in Eastern Europe and try to basically make sense of how the Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians, and other groups basically targeted the Jews during the Nazi invasion of East Europe from 1941 until 1945. But then we can basically find the same question in Rwanda, in Bosnia, and in different contexts, in the sense that, like, how come ordinary people who basically spend lots of time with each other became basically killers of each other? So this is basically kind of really the main problematic I am focusing on. So I'm going to basically be kind of really quick here because it basically requires lots of kind of different explanation. But then basically, once scholars talk about what really explains bottom of violence, there are probably 5-6 different factors we can identify. So I basically call them more like mechanisms. And in the book, basically, I offer a much kind of a extensive treatment. But obviously, there can be many different reasons why somebody, an ordinary person, engaged in mass violence. So the first two are my main arguments, hatred, that I briefly described, historical from stigmatization of an outgroup. In this case, it will be Yazidis. And the second one, as I will explain in a second, is more about resentment. It's basically more about the changes in political structure, which basically means that previously despised group became, or at least person become powerful, and this basically creates this kind of a reaction on the part of the in-group to kind of basically bring them down. And my argument is that once you have this combination, hatred and resentment, this became very dangerous, and this basically explains why many local people in Iraq in 2014 actually went after the Yazidis. But then if you look at other contexts, we can definitely talk about Greek. So you basically mentioned me that Bedrosian, who basically wrote a book about the Adana massacres of 1909, will come here. I mean, in the case of Armenian genocide and the previous episodes, definitely Greek play a role because Armenians used to be much more powerful, richer, and their property obviously became the main target by their neighbors. In other contexts, it can be about fear. It simply means that you basically feel that if you don't engage in hostile action, the other group will do it, and the only way basically to ensure your security is kind of really engage in aggression before they do. And the last one is basically guilt, which is actually a common occurrence in during the Holocaust in local communities. It doesn't really apply to the case I'm going to focus on, but I kind of really just also engage with this to basically show that, I mean, there are different mechanisms, but then the two main mechanisms which are important here are the hatred and resentment. So let me give you more information about what really happened in Sinjar in Iraq in August 2014. So this is obviously Iraq, Syria. I mean, this is basically a desert area. Like if you look at Mosul, Tigris River, Tal Afar, Syria. and then it's basically the kind of the Yezidi homeland. So it was interesting because for many centuries, Yezidis were living on Mansinjar. So for example, if you look at the records of Evliya Çelebi from the 7th century, he basically described them as being, I think, hairy infidels, because they used to kind of attack Ottoman caravans between Diyarbakir and Mosul during that time. And if you look at the map, it's kind of a surgical connection, because if you want to make a connection between Anatolia and Mosul, you basically go through the Mansinjar, and basically gives advantage to many Yezid tribes until the end of the Ottoman Empire. So there were lots of different expeditions by the Ottomans, and they are basically known as firmans in the Yezidi oral history. But then in the 1970s, Saddam basically brought them to the plain because he wants to control them. So what happened is that by 2003, most of the Yezidis in this area were basically living in the villages either in the north or south of the mountain. So like for example, Tilezer, Sivashe, Kıdır, and Kocho, like 3 areas where lots of people were killed in August 2014. They were the areas where Yezidis were relocated by Saddam back in the 1970s. And the issue is that if you look at the south area and then to the east, they were mostly Sunni Arab areas, with some also Turkoman presence in Talafar. So these were the people who will attack the Yezidis basically 10 years ago. So I briefly mentioned about the fall of Mosul in June 2024. So then, not surprisingly, if you are IS, you are basically capturing this area. You also control most of the Syria, northern Syria. I mean, it basically was more like a matter of question, like a timing, when the IS will try to take over Sinjar. But then, Sinjar has some protection in the shape of the Peshmerga. There are probably around 7,000 Peshmerga forces. And this is very controversial because ultimately Peshmerga did not fight. These are basically Kurdish forces coming from Erbil and Süleymaniye. They simply fled, and this is basically the common maybe lamentation among the Yezidis. They basically say Peshmerga Revin. In Kurdish, it basically means that Peshmerga fled because they did not put any resistance. And this became like a big shock and sense of betrayal among the Yezidis because they thought that at least they will put some resistance against IS, but they basically end up not fighting, with some couple of exceptions. And the other sense of betrayal, which is I think kind of really difficult, is that many Yazidis were really surprised that the people they know as people end up attacking them. So these are not just strangers coming from other countries or basically from Syria. Most of the people who basically conducted attacks were actually their neighbors from the neighboring villages. So there were the people who basically attended their circumcision like ceremonies, their weddings, and they basically engaged them in trade. So these are the people they knew in most cases by name. So they were basically strangers. And the term kref, I basically heard a lot in my own interviews. It basically means like kirve in Turkish. It basically simply means a person holding the boy during the circumcision. So the basic idea from the Yazidi perspective is that if you have an Arab neighbor doing that, it kind of establishes rapport and trust, because once the boy's blood is on the cloth of the, let's say, the Arab sheikh, then the expectation is that that Arab sheikh is going to be a kref, kirve, and he's not going to try to take over the Yazidi woman. So it's kind of really kind of old practice for many generations. But then again, what happened is that some of these krefs end up being rapers of the Yazidi woman. And one other interesting thing is I tried to kind of use some of the words I kind of collected from interviews just to give more credit to the people who basically had this terrible experiences. It's a Kurdish term, mal mirati. It kind of means, difficult to translate, but it basically means more like, may your house be burned. It's more like a kind of a curse. And one interesting connection I kind of really discovered after talking to some of my Kurdish friends is that this was a term used by some of the Kurdish families in the Armenian genocide, in the sense that the people who were active in the Armenian genocide were also called mal mirati, which basically means that these were the people who betrayed the Armenians by basically taking over their properties. And I like almost basically a century later, then you have these groups also accused of being a mal mirati, but this time the targets were not Armenians and the attackers were not Kurdish, they were mostly Sunni Arabs and Turkomans. But again, this kind of really captures this deep sense of betrayal in the sense that the people we used to know became our tormentors. So, in terms of numbers, I mean, I think our sensitivity to numbers basically declined given the world is on fire. But then if you think about the number of people who were killed or captured, it's kind of a really high, just given the sheer number of the Yazidis in the world. So, in August 2014, around 1,500 Yazidis were killed. They were mostly executed. 1,500 more of them actually died on Mansinjar. I mean, it was August, 110 degrees, no food, no water, and I mean, until the Obama strikes, which probably took place maybe 5 days after the initial attacks, they were basically stranded because there was an IS siege, and then around like 1,500 people were also died on Mansinjar. So around like more than 3,000 Yazidis died in a matter of a couple of weeks, and maybe more kind of disturbingly, around 6,800 Yazidis, mostly being women and young children, were taken as captives. So women were become sex slaves, so they basically subject to mass rape, and then the young children, when I say young children, like younger than the age of 13, they become indoctrinated, and they were basically incorporated the IS army. So it has been 10 years. So many of these people, some have survived, some of them being ransomed through the Kurdish authorities. Others escaped. I mean, the most famous is basically Nadia Murad, who won the Nobel Peace Prize back in 2018. I think she is remaining captive for 3 months. And then, interestingly, she was one of the most articulate women because she had more education. So she becomes kind of an international figure since then. But then, around maybe like half of these people, like around like more than 3,000, nobody knew what happened to them. So probably some of them died, because there was lots of warfare. And then you still basically hear stories of the Yazidi women who became assimilated to the families who basically captured them, but they completely kind of forgot their own identity. Because some of these people were very young. I mean, if you basically get kidnapped at the age of 8 or 9, after 10 years, you completely develop a new identity. And then given the fact that there are probably only around 500,000 Yazidis in the world, if you make the calculation, you can say that 1 in 50 Yazidis in the world were either killed or captured in a matter of a couple of weeks. And then half of the entire population, which is around like 250,000 people, were directly displaced. So it's basically, I mean, again, the Yazidis is a very small community. We only talk about 500,000 people in the world, and given the numbers, it kind of really devastated the entire structure of the society. So, okay, you can ask me, like, I mean, how did you study this topic? So, I mean, people who are studying political violence, that kind of violence have two different approaches. You either talk to people who did the bad stuff, the perpetrators, or you talk to victims, the survivors. I mean, ideally you want to talk to both sides. In this case, I didn't have a chance to talk to perpetrators, and I can explain why. So I mostly talk to survivors, who basically either displaced, captured, or basically indirectly kind of know lots of things happening to Yazidis. So most of the interviews I conducted with the help of a PhD student by that time were actually in Iraqi Kurdistan, because even now, after 10 years, most people who were displaced end up still living in the camps. I mean, this is just one typical camp street. You basically see the conditions, and again, it's just one thing to live in a camp for a couple of maybe months, but then many people end up still living in the camps for a decade. Others become refugees. Germany basically accepted some of these women. Same thing with like small number with France. Others end up coming to Nebraska, United States, because there's already a Yazidi community here. Or others basically end up to Australia and so on. But the entire community was either dispersed, and I mean, and I will explain in a second, it is no longer possible to return to Sinjar because it's basically a very contested area. I mean, this is not an easy thing to study, not because of the topic, but then there are lots of ethical challenges because the women were specifically women who survived. They were actually exploited by the journalists, by different groups, because their stories became this kind of sensational stories which were basically shared by media outlets. So then, I mean, you basically became kind of conscious of these issues, and then I try to be as ethical as possible, but then, I mean, I can talk a lot more, because sometimes you just make decisions on the spot. Sometimes you don't want to talk to people, but then they start talking about their stories. And then again, these people are not having their own country. They are subject to Kurdish authority, and there are also some tensions between the Kurds, the Sunni Kurds, and the Yazidis. I mean, also coming from the fact that the Peshmerga, which was supposed to protect them, end up not protecting them. So, but I can talk about them later, just to give you the impression that talking to survivors in the camps is actually a kind of a difficult thing, and it basically has a more like ethical minefield from my perspective. Okay, so let me just try to kind of summarize my main argument. So, and as I just mentioned earlier, my argument is kind of really combines hatred with resentment. And for those of you who are familiar with the broader literature on Holocaust, for example, the two big approaches are dispositional versus situational. Like, for example, if somebody says that anti-Semitism played a big role in German destruction of the Jews in Europe, then you basically make a more dispositional argument because you basically focus on people's beliefs and faith systems. Versus if somebody says that ordinary people like Eichmann, which is obviously the central figure in Arendt's understanding of the Holocaust, well, they are ordinary people, but they become monsters because of the situations, then you basically make a situational argument. So how I basically approach this is that I kind of try to combine a dispositional approach with the situational, and then try to explain what happened in Sinjar back in 2014. So just to make it more specific, so when I talk about hatred, it's obviously a historical process. It's not like it came from space. These things basically appear historically, and they are kind of transmitted across generations, I will say at least since the 16th century. So I basically put because I mean, for those of you who basically know Islamic history, Ibn Taymiyyah, which is a very important figure from the late 12th and early 13th century. So when you look at basically his writings, you basically see lots of criticism of the Yazidis. He doesn't call them as being devil worshippers, but he basically makes the argument that they kind of corrupted Sheikh Adi's teachings, which is basically more like a Sufi teachings. And then many other scholars since then, I mean, in the late Ottoman, early Turkish Republic times, kind of refer to Ibn Taymiyyah when they basically criticized the Yazidis being devil worshippers, or basically more like being heretical group who doesn't really deserve to be like any kind of a recognition and respect. I can go into more details, but then maybe I can tell in the Q&A, because you can make the argument that under Saddam it was a more secular system, how come these things basically still remain? But then Saddam had this kind of failed campaign in the early 1990s, because he lost the war with Kuwait because of the failed invasion, and he kind of really instrumentalized religion in the early 1990s, which also meant that many of the Salafi sheikhs who later became part of the IS really find a platform to kind of preach these anti-Yezidi talks and discourses in Iraq during that time. So in a sense, I mean, this is just that there's all these like different historical processes which basically resulted in this kind of a dissemination of the religious stigmatization. But then the other thing is that one problem with this kind of argument is that if something is there, how are you going to explain timing? Because I mean, just because you kind of have this stereotypical pejorative understanding of religion, it doesn't mean that you are going to attack them next day. I mean, you may not like them, you may hate them, but it doesn't mean that you are basically going to engage in violence. So my argument is that to be able to understand why Yazidis were attacked in 2014, and specifically after the post-2003 period, is that we need to understand what happened in northern Iraq politically throughout the to kind of really understand the motivations of the local people. But then let me just kind of just be more specific here. So hatred is important from my perspective because, I mean, yes, IS was very violent, it basically killed lots of people, but then it was exceptionally brutal against Yazidis because there was no other group which was kidnapped completely, or which was not basically subject to massacre compared to Yazidis. I mean, and if you look at basically how the IS justified the violence against Yazidis, it was purely religious. So there was nothing political about the justification of violence against Yazidis in IS publications. And then when you look at how it treated the Shias and Christian women, so I don't want to kind of give the impression that they were treated very well, but again, nothing comparable to the treatment of the Yazidi women. So in a sense, like for example, there were Christian women in Mosul, many of them basically let go. I mean, they were basically not kind of really just kidnapped or basically subject to mass rape. So there's kind of really a qualitative difference in how the IS justified these practices. And again, all the justification was saying that these are devil worshippers, like more like even using the word murtad, that you will remember that. And then from this perspective, they have no right to basically for anything at all. And I just give an example, like kind of like if you look at the bottom of the slide, it basically is a quote from one of the interviews. And then what the picture you get from these people is that even before 2014, between 2003 and 2014, it became like a hell for Yazidis to live in northern Iraq. Because whenever they go to Mosul for trade, for education, they were subject to lots of discrimination. It became very dangerous. And then in a sense that this person is saying that I survived because I claimed I was a Christian, which is kind of interesting by itself because, I mean, again, Christians are not necessarily treated very well by the IS. But then that person survived because, again, if he basically says I'm a Yazidi, they will basically kill the person on the spot. Because again, from this perspective, they have no right to live in this country. But again, it's not only about religion here because my argument is that the political reserve play a very important role. And just to summarize it, what happened is that Yazidis never become a powerful group. I mean, they were always on the margins in whatever polity we are talking about. But for the first time in their history, they become more visible because Kurds, the Sunni Kurds, needed the Yazidis as a bloc to be able to control Nineveh, which is basically this province of Iraq where Mosul is located. And I can give you more specific example about that, but the basic idea is that the Kurds instrumentalized the Yazidis to be able to kind of really have some control over this province at the expense of the Sunni Arabs. So if you look from the Sunni Arab and also Turkmen perspective, this was completely unacceptable because these were the people who were working for the Ba'ath party. Think about Talafar, which used to be main recruitment area for the Ba'ath party for many decades. So for the first time, the people you despise because you thought that these are basically just people who don't even want to talk to, became more, at least symbolically more powerful, if not in reality, but because they became part of the Kurdish quest for control over Nineveh. And then, which is interesting, is that when you talk to Yazidis, you also get this feeling, because for some Yazidis, this became like a very difficult situation to sustain, because they basically see this hatred from the Sunni Arabs and Turkomans, but then they did not really trust the Kurds either, because they realized that the Kurds actually use them, and this basically creates even more reaction among the Sunni Arabs and Turkomans in the area. And this basically kind of like one just quote I used from one of the interviews, because again, like Arabs used to be more friendly with the Yazidis before 2003, but after that now Yazidis become perceived as being more Kurdish, which also meant that they just basically kind of really attack all this ire. So then, there's a reason why the Yazidis were actually attacked after 2003, not before that, because again, because of the change in the political circumstances. And also, like, I did work on Kurds for a long time, the Kurdish people like in Turkey and in Iraq primarily. And then one thing I basically find very interesting is that if you talk to any single Kurd in Iraq, they will have a very positive image of the United States, because this United States is basically the country which invaded Iraq in 2003 and which basically led to the liberation of the Kurdistan from the Iraqi control, at least partially. But once you basically talk to Yazidis, even if they're also Kurdish speaking, you basically get a completely different image, because from their perspective, Saddam was a dictator, he was authoritarian, he basically displaced them, but he also controlled the violence under check. So from their perspective, he was a guy who did not basically let other people attack the Yazidis, because he basically wanted to monopolize violence. Which also meant that as long as Yazidis were not Kurdish, or they did not basically support Kurdish nationalism, they were not really targeted by Saddam. Which is basically the big difference between the Kurdish and the Yazidi experience under Iraq from basically under Saddam times. Which is also interesting that Yazidis talk about 7 to 3 months expeditions, but they don't really talk about a single expedition from 1921 until 2003, because again, this was the time of Iraqi Republic where it was partially secular, which also meant that there was no religious violence against the Yazidis during this entire period. So I don't want to give the impression that the Yazidis actually like Saddam, but again, compared to what will happen after Saddam, they had a much kind of a positive image of the rule under Saddam Hussein, which is obviously completely different than the Kurdish experience, because obviously they were subject to genocidal campaign back in the 1980s. Okay, so I'm basically coming to the end of my talk. So when I think about these issues, I mean, sometimes when I give a talk about this topic, the question you get is that, can you basically tell us something more positive? Because ultimately, I mean, if I talk about all these negative things, then the question is that, I mean, can we talk about something more positive about Yazidis? Well, partially yes, because if nothing else, now you can make the argument that for the first time in their entire history, Yazidis became this image of a globally persecuted minority. And again, I give the example of Nadia Murad, which is just one woman. But then again, like when you talk about that, they basically kind of attracted some sympathy from Western countries. Some of them basically find asylum in Europe. And in a sense, like many people get motivated to help them. So they really become this image of a persecuted religious minority in the contemporary world. But the problem is that when you look at what's happening on the ground, it is not there's not much ground for optimism. There's a video, maybe I should not show the video, but if you look at this picture, it is kind of very telling from my perspective, because that ruined building, it is from Sinjar. It used to be a technical academy where the IS killed around 80 people, mostly old women, back in August 15, 2014. And the mother of Nadia Murad basically found there, so it's basically a mass grave. So what happened is that Nadia's initiative, which was established after the genocide, they basically get enough funds to establish a memorial. So in a sense, they established a memorial in Sinjar. The problem is that it is almost impossible to visit this memorial unless you are from the region. So I find a researcher in Iraq. He basically navigated 10 different checkpoints just to basically travel from Erbil to Sinjar, basically in March of this year. So again, there's some kind of symbolic recognition, symbolic justice, but once you basically look at what's happening in Sinjar, it is basically an area which means that nobody can actually return. I mean, I can get in details, but then there are the Hashd Shabi, Iraqi army, then the Kurdish Peshmerga, Yazidis had their own like different groups, and then obviously Turkey become involved because of PKK connection. So it's just kind of this completely insecure area, which make it completely difficult for Yazidis to return. And most of the Sinjar actually still remains in ruins. So the only thing which basically were done in the area is this kind of a interesting memorial, which basically commemorates the people who were killed during the Yazidi genocide. Okay, so then it's almost like one of my last slides. So that again, the question is basically how can we think about what really maintains religious plurality? So I would say the conventional paradigm, it's not all about the religious plurality, but think about the United States, the racial relations, tensions, ethnic plurality. This kind of notion, the never again paradigm, which obviously comes from the Holocaust, is so central. The basic idea is that you go to a memorial, you basically see what happened to people, you become sad, you become upset, and you basically said, okay, I'm going to make sure that this thing will never going to happen. And it's basically a classical paradigm you will see in the Holocaust Museum in DC. But if you go to Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, I was there back in December, again, this is the paradigm you see there. Because again, basic idea is that you see what happened, it is terrible, it is horrific, and then it is going to kind of really lead to some kind of reckoning with the past, which also meant that it's not never going to happen. So and this is a picture from Montgomery, Alabama. I went there twice. It's kind of an interesting place because Montgomery, Alabama is a very racist place. It's very segregated. But then you have this kind of an important lynching memorial in downtown area, which is dedicated to the memory of more than 4,000 African Americans who were lynched during the Jim Crow era, from the late 19th century until the mid 20th century. So when I think about the Yazidi genocide memorial, I basically see some parallels. But then my cynical side is that, again, if you ask the question, how can we maintain religious plurality? And I give you a very cynical answer, which basically comes from Walter Benjamin's basic insight. And the basic insight is that if you have a state typically wants to monopolize violence. It's also kind of coming to obviously Max Weber. Basic idea is that if the state kind of really wants to monopolize violence, they don't really let ordinary people take justice into their hands. So if you think about the justice as a natural law, when the ordinary people want to take the mantle of natural law, they will be prevented by the state as long as the state wants to preserve the political order and positive law. So from this perspective, and I will give one example. So you will basically not see many episodes of bottom of violence, as you basically saw in Iraq in 2014 or in Turkey in the late 20th century, as long as there's a state which basically makes sure that the liminal minorities are basically stay subordinated. Because if that is the case, then the ordinary people will not basically feel the resentment to kind of attack and target the liminal minority. And I mean, I was talking to Halil earlier today, and then one thing I kind of always think about that, there were two big massacres of Alevis in Turkey, one in Marash, 1979, the other is in Sivas, 1993, and I talk about them in the book. But then why nothing happened under the AKP? Because you can make the argument that AKP is very anti-Alevi, and we can obviously give many different examples. But simple response is that because AKP makes sure that the Alevis basically stay in their own places. They don't basically become politically ascendant, they don't become very politically demanding, which also meant that then ordinary people do not feel that they need to kind of really target the Alevis. And in the book I also talk about, for example, why there is no big anti-Baha'i massacre in Iran, or why there is no big anti-Ahmadi massacre in Pakistan. Well, because in both cases, you codify the religious differences, which basically subordinates the liminal minority into the positive law, because both Pakistan and Iran has strong religious elements, which also meant that they are kind of really subordinated. They are not in a position to kind of make demands, and if this is the case, then ordinary people basically stay quiet. It doesn't mean that they basically enjoy their presence, but then they also don't feel that they need to attack these liminal groups. So this is kind of really a very cynical argument, but again, it's basically kind of one of the conclusions of the book. Okay, I think I will stop here, but I always basically put this slide because it kind of reminds me why we study these topics, because there's lots of human suffering in the world. This kind of a famous poem by Odin, he wrote it like a year before the start of the Second World War. But the basic idea is that life goes on, other people suffer, we don't really think about other people. But when I think about the Yazidis, it always reminds me that, I mean, I need to think about the Yazidis because this is the reason I end up basically writing this book. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for this very rich conversation. I had a chance to take a look at the book, even though like I haven't read all of that. And it really is an ambitious project. it tries to formulate one thing that many social scientists are wrestling with. How can we articulate the independent causal power of religion, not as a reflection, not as a superstructure, but for its moral power itself. It is ambitious because it tries to develop a very nuanced argument within the literature. So, on the one hand, yes, religion can indeed be like mediated by some other ulterior motives, but something has to be said about, according to Tezcür, something has to be said about the substance of religion itself. Does religion account for certain types of violence? Can we really go back to Islam's theology to explain certain genocidal violence examples? So I congratulate him for that, for this effort, and I do have some questions. I will first ask him to basically elaborate on certain parts of his argument, and then I will open it up to the questions here. Yes, so religion is an independent variable. Theology has its own force in itself, and like some people really do engage in violence for the sake of Allah, basically. As we say in Turkish, Allah rızası için, they commit genocide. But if we look at the cases, like the most extreme cases, like the Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, still ethnically minority people would seem to be bearing the brunt of genocidal violence. So, and those same variables are also in place to explain the genocide of Armenians. Basically, they gained status, they got involved with European powers, and they gained status, they gained education, they were already rich, and that imbalance, like the fact that Armenians basically no longer were content with their subjugated status, that made them more vulnerable to genocidal violence. So, on the one hand, we can explain with this general framework, the other violence instances. So, what can explain the nuance of liminal minority when we try to analyze genocidal violence? Like, what makes them different? What makes liminal minorities different in terms of their vulnerability, as they were not the primary victims of genocides in history, but they were part of those victims. Another question is about liminal minorities in non-Muslim contexts. So who are the liminal minorities in European history? And one thing that confused me when I was reading this book is about certain cases. For instance, the Baha'i case in Iran. So according to the model, so when under Shah, they were like arguably better off, they should have been the targets of like Muslim violence, religious violence. But as you said in the book, after the Iranian Revolution, after Shah was toppled, they were subjugated, So that should stop bottom-up violence. Did it stop bottom-up violence in that case? And yeah, generally, I can stop here. Like when we introduce liminality into the framework, how does it differ from other forms of genocidal violence? So these are my questions.
So, thank you, Alev, because this was a very on-the-spot question, especially the first one, because I also talk about the Armenian genocide to a certain extent, and obviously I'm not an expert on the topic, but then there are lots of like distinguished historians that know about that. I mean, yes, in a sense, people still discuss there's some controversy about the role of religion in especially motivating ordinary people, like if you think about the Kurdish tribes attacking the Armenians, but obviously nobody's going to say that the young Turks were actually motivated by religion, because I mean, obviously there's more or less a consensus. But there's some controversy about the role of religion, especially at the kind of the ordinary level. But the argument I make is that if you don't basically insert the term liminality, which obviously means stigmatization and hatred, there's no way you can understand the ferocity of the violence targeting both Yazidis in 2014 and the Alevis back in the late 20th century. Because in both cases, I can obviously make some, I do that in the book, especially in the Alevi chapter. I mean, you can make the argument that yes, the Armenians were basically more prosperous, which is basically greed, but they also had more Western connections, which basically meant that they were more threatening to the local people and the Ottoman authorities. But you can't say the same thing for neither for Yazidis or Alevis. So in a sense, unless you basically look at how the religious differences play a role in shaping the mass action, there's no way we can understand, especially there's no way we can understand why so many Yazidi women were killed and enslaved back in 2014 as opposed to another group. Because I mean, from this logic, you may say that actually maybe the Christians should be more targeted because they obviously had more Western connections. Or the Shiites, because Shia were basically much more linked to the authorities in Baghdad. So the liminality actually comes into play to really understand the scope and the character of violence in these two episodes. And to clarify, I don't always say that, I mean, liminals always get targeted more than other groups. I mean, it's not like you basically look at the frequency. It just basically try to understand how come religion plays a role in these kind of relations more than other episodes. So, regarding your question, I mean, in the book, towards the end, I talk about some liminal groups in non-Muslim contexts. One classical example would be, I also saw them at Stanford. They're actually always on university campuses, the Jehovah's Witnesses. So I basically make the argument that Jehovah's Witnesses in Christian countries can be actually discovered as liminal. Because there are lots of kind of questions about their connection to Christianity. And also I basically claim that the Mormons, not nowadays, but then up until the mid-20th century, can be also classified as being a liminal minority. And maybe like more kind of an unusual example would be like Rastafarians in Jamaica or like in Barbados. So regarding your third question about the Baha'is, so there was actually a riot against the Baha'is back in 1955 under Shah. So Baha'is were, yes, they were more incorporated to the Iranian system, but then they also became targets of scapegoating by the young Shah, because when he was weak, he basically used Baha'is to kind of really scapegoat to get more support from the ulama. But especially after he basically managed to put this kind of really consolidate power by the early 1960s. He basically protected Baha'is because, he basically kept bottom of violence under check. So just to kind of make a correction to what I said, there was actually bottom of violence against Baha'is during the revolution, especially in the early 1980s during this transition period. But then since then, most of the violence is actually either incited by the authorities or it was basically kept under check. And again, it doesn't mean that the Baha'is enjoy their life in Iran. It simply means that they are not basically targets of mass violence. At the same time, they're obviously subject to all kind of discrimination. Same thing with the experience of Ahmadis in Pakistan at the moment. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we are opening it up to audience questions. And we'll let them in, please.
Well, thank you so much. This is an incredible talk. The book sounds absolutely amazing. Can't wait to read it. I have two questions.
Sure.
First, so the theoretical framework, the state and the monopoly of violence, violence against liminal minorities. Does it matter whether the empire versus the nation state? I'd like to say a few words about that. And specifically, I'm thinking the Ottoman Empire versus post-Ottoman Iraq, post-Ottoman Turkey. Like, is there a difference which system is in place, essentially, and about how they think about the monopoly of violence against the monopoly? Okay. The second question, excuse my ignorance, could you please bring up to speed all the situation in Sudan right now and after the genocide, and whether something changes for the survivors? Like, given that there's so many roadblocks that actually to get to that place, roadblocks, from what I understand, are put by the Iraqi Kurds. So, are they somehow better integrated into the framework of the Kurdish state? Or
I mean, okay, so I mean, the first question is really interesting because I kind of grappled with it for a long time. So if you look at, again, since we talk about the Yazidis a lot, so if you look at the Yazidi experience on the Ottomans, from their oral history, it's a completely vernacular culture, by the way. I mean, there's no real written source about the Yazidis until recently. They basically claim that we were subject to Ottoman campaigns because of religious difference. But in reality, it's not the case, because you can make the argument that they were targeted because they were controlling Sinjar, they were controlling caravan routes. So when the Ottomans had the expeditions by different pashas, they kind of tried to basically prevent the Yazidis really disturbing the commercial linkages. So it's kind of like a mixed kind of a picture. But at the same time, even under the Ottoman times, you basically find very clear, explicit religious justification for violence. And not only by the Ottoman pashas, but also Kurdish basically base. Like especially in the 19th century. But there's this kind of famous campaign in the 1830s, which basically killed lots of Yazidis and also captured lots of their women. And it was entirely justified on religious grounds. Ali will know it better than me. The Abdülhamid's Tacit Akaid campaigns in the late 19th century, one target was also the Yazidis. And it was kind of more, it was partial, it didn't basically go completely because they get some reaction. But ultimately, during that time, the state capacity was also very low, which also meant that there were so many things they could do against the Yazidis. But then again, with the Ottoman modernization of the late 19th century, you see a clear attempt by the Ottomans, not only kill them, but basically kind of really make them more Muslim. Kind of similar to what they did with the Alevi villages, like maybe erecting mosques, starting with the late 19th century. So when you come to the nation state, it became different, and I totally talk about the Saddam era, but also like for the entire Iraqi Republic, it was a better time. Not because the state was basically more open, but then since there was no religious justification for the state actions, it basically provided more space for the Yazidis. The problem is that it also created lots of resentment among the ordinary people, because the basic idea is that, especially after Saddam was overthrown, then all the religious groups which were kept under check by the Saddam, now they basically have free hand to target the Yazidis. So I'm not basically saying that secularism is a panacea to liminality, because again, unless ordinary people or the ulama or basic leaders of the religion change their minds, there will be always potential for violence against them. So, but yeah, so current situation in Sinjar, which is actually very unfortunate, because I mean, I think nobody will say that ISIS can return to that place in the next 5-6 years, because it is completely fragmented. Most of the people who commit the genocidal violence are still around. They basically switch sides. Now they are basically more linked to the Iraqi government. They are basically part of the Hashd al-Shabi even, which is kind of interesting by itself. I mean, there is no real mechanism through which people were basically had some kind of reconciliation. So there are no real mechanisms for truth-telling. So it's just all basically based on vengeance, in a sense that there are some revenge killings about the Yazidis, but ultimately, if you're a Yazidi, there is no way you can return there because it's all basically destroyed. So it's basically still in ruins. And this is the reason most of the Yazidis are still in camps in Iraqi Kurdistan, or they end up leaving Iraq. And some of them basically left Iraq through certain programs, but others basically also drawn in the agency, like many other refugees nowadays. So, yeah.
Thank you, Hali.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much raising the question about the Yazidi. I have two questions. One, I am just curious, because you are from Turkey. I am wondering if you read the book from a Turkish medical doctor with the name of Dede Korkuk. He is neuropsychiatrist, and
Okay.
he wrote book Life Alert about Muhammad.
Okay.
And the disease that Muhammad had, that is partial complex epilepsy. And then he looked at that disease and how it funded, how it created Islam. It's very interesting book, because there is also Iranian American with name of Dr. Abbas Sadeghian, also neuroscientist doctor. He wrote also Sword and Seizure, but the Turkish one is Dr. Dede Korkuk is very good. I'm wondering if you read that. It's a fascinating book. The second, that is my question. you talk about the plurality, and as I understand by Professor Ahmed Abdul Samad, that is professor in history of Islam, he looks at Islam before Muhammad, and Kaaba was very pluralistic. All religion, from pagan to Buddhist to whatever, Jews, Christian, everyone was there. And he discussed about that it was as a matter of fact, Muhammad who came and broke everything and started the fascistic idea of Islam. He calls it Islamic fascism. And he explained what happened because he was the historian for many years, taught in Germany and Japan. My question is that, is it ever possible to have a pluralistic, I understand that we have a modern Muslim or Muslim not in power, because modern Muslim is like when they get the Western's value. But in my opinion, the real Muslim is Muhammad, who killed and slaughtered, as Professor Abdul Hussein Zarwin put in, 2 centuries of silence. He explained that, like, slaughtered Iranian culture and slaughtered, genocides the Jews and so on. I feel that real Islam is Houthis, ISIS, Islamic regime of Iran, Taliban, those are real Islam. This modern Islam that don't know, here we see.
Just give opportunity to other people, so.
They have this, but they have tons of makeup and they don't know what is that. They just have the hijab. These are not Muslim. My parents are praying and go to Hajj, but they are not Muslim. But can we have real pluralistic Islam when from beginning Muhammad was fascist?
I mean, maybe it's always a very kind of a complicated and convoluted like the process. But I mean, just from a practical point of view, if you think about there are like 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, it needs to be, yeah, I mean, it basically means that you need to kind of really engage the Muslim authorities and the publics to be able to talk about religious freedom and religious coexistence. Because, I mean, yes, you can basically make the argument that, like many other religions, the religion may have very strong authoritarian elements from the beginning, which is maybe not surprising. But at the end of the day, it's basically the belief system of so many people. And then the question becomes, can you basically talk about processes through which those people have basically more tolerant for people like Yazidis? And I think yes, because when I think about like some of the Muslim reactions to what happened to Yazidis, well, I mean, yeah, but then many people condemn the IS violence. They all basically talk about Yazidis basically deserving dignity and recognition. So all these things are kind of really not written in stone, so they can be more flexible depending on the circumstances. So I mean, yes, my response will be more optimistic in this sense. So yeah.
Yeah. So hi, thank you so much for coming. I have 2 questions.
Sure. Yeah.
So my first question is kind of easy. Like, what was your inspiration behind writing this book, and why do you believe this topic is important? It's clear that you're very passionate about it, but just kind of what's the motivation behind it?
Yeah, I mean, my passion is that I obviously knew what happened in 2014, but not until 2017, I basically developed inception to write the book. And then the reason is that because I encountered a couple of Yazidi people from, originally from Turkey, but that they live in Germany. And they basically did a documentary which basically talk about what happened in 2014. So this basically inspired me to kind of really have a much closer look at the Yazidi experience. And then we should care about that because maybe coming back to your question, if you care about religious diversity, which is obviously so central to human experience, here's an example of how religious diversity can be very fragile. I mean, for example, in this country we have lots of different issues, maybe less so with religious diversity, because like racial issues are much more important nowadays. But ultimately, I mean, it's basically one of the most important issues in the entire world, like how to kind of really make sure that people from different religions can actually get along with each other. And obviously the cases I'm focusing on are the worst cases, but then obviously we can learn what really kind of led to the collapse of this coexistence to be able to talk about more sustainable coexistence in other countries. So, yeah.
Thank you. And my second question is, well, you talked about the role of religion and politics in mass violence to liminal minorities, through the lens of the Yezidi genocide. But I was wondering, like, how do you think these concepts can be seen in our world today, given the political context of what's happening in Israel and Gaza? And if you feel like, oh, it's more of like through the lens of religion or through politics, or, you know, because you were talking about hatred and resentment. So just.
Yeah, I mean, so it basically goes back to the question of the Armenian genocide, because again, like the most typical approach in social science is that you think that religion is not that important in shaping human behavior, because then you seek economic interest, political power, and these things are more important in most classical accounts. But then again, like you can also make the argument that if there's this kind of religious stigmas, and I only talk about liminal minorities, but you can also talk about stigmas characterizing other religious relations. Unless you basically address them, it always creates the potential for violence. I mean, it doesn't mean that just because there are some stigmas, people basically going to kill each other. But then it always basically makes much more difficult for people to understand each other and have basic respect for each other. And it's not only about the liminal groups, but then you can talk about all that kind of stigmas in many different contexts. I mean, think about, like, let's say the Muslim-Hindu relations in India under Modi nowadays. So, but I mean, just addressing them basically explicitly will be so important for talking about religious coexistence. So, yeah.
And then my last question was that you said that the way to maintain like religious plurality is for the government to essentially ensure that the citizens that belong to the dominant group, they don't like attack liminal groups or like take matters into their own hands. But my question is like, what if the government also kind of aligns with the views of the dominant group, but they also hold resentment and hatred for that liminal group? Then what do we do to kind of?
Then you have the Baha'is in Iran situation, or Ahmadis in Pakistan, which basically means that the government really codifies religious differences to the positive law. So the entire legal system basically discriminates against certain religious groups. So in a sense that they basically suffer, but at the same time, and I'm not saying in a positive way, just to kind of being more cynical, they are not going to subject of to mass violence, because then they are basically being subordinated to the dominant group. I mean, is this a situation you want kind of live as a liminal group? Of course not. But at the same time, you are not killed compared to what happened to Yazidis in 2014. So it's not like a solution in this sense, but it's more like a very cynical reading of how these things actually play out in other contexts in some of the other countries. So I'm not saying that it's basically what we should be doing, but this is what I observe in countries like Iran or Pakistan nowadays, or even Turkey with the Alevis nowadays.
Yeah, on that note, actually, I want to add one more question. Like, what would be your short answer to this famous question of genocide denialists? Like, Armenian genocide could not have happened because there was military system, and if Ottomans would have committed genocide, they would have already exterminated them a long time ago. What's your short answer to that?
I mean, again, like there are lots of historians basically look at what happened in the late 19th century and early 20th century, like kind of Ronsuni, like Yektan, for example, like in his dissertation and so on. But it's about political resentment. I think the main argument you will make is that there's actually this changes in power, which basically meant that the Armenians became more assertive, they have more international connections, which also make them much more vulnerable in the eyes of the ordinary Muslim population in different parts of Anatolia. But obviously this is a local dynamic, then obviously you think about geopolitical calculations of the Young Turks, which is obviously what really led to the genocide of 1915.
Yeah, so as long as they accepted their subjugated position, they were not vulnerable to mass violence in that extent.
Yes, and I can even think about some other examples not in the Muslim countries. I mean, now I live in Arizona, I became more interested in the experience of Native Americans, and I can basically make the argument that Native Americans actually get maybe the most sympathy among all the groups in the entire country. Is this because people really care about Native Americans? No, but then they are very weak, they are basically very fragmented. I mean, they were almost subject to complete extermination in the early 20th century, which also meant that they don't have much political agency. So if you don't basically see the minority having a political agency, you no longer feel it's a threat, there's no resentment, and you basically think that you can actually like them. But then if you basically have the blacks, then it can be more threatening because they are basically more assertive, as it happened in the last couple of years in this country, then there can be more backlash. But yes, I mean, my argument is that resentment can be very dangerous if the majority basically had the resentfulness against the minority, because then they just want to level it down, bring it back. So I think this basically, I don't talk about it, but in the book, this is my main argument about why there was a massacre against Alevis in Marash, 78, and in Sivas also in 93. They just want to bring Alevis to the earth because they have more public presence in both these extremely conservative central atrocities. So yeah.
Thank you. Ali, please.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to have you here. I'm very sorry for the situation.
This is just one.
My understanding is that Yazidis, I just read one paragraph in your book and about collective memory, and it says there's no strong collective memory about the previous violence in Yazidi world, right? I mean, am I?
You mean the Yazidis themselves, or
Yazidis themselves?
So they have a very strong collective memory about Ottoman violence, but not necessarily since the beginning of 20th century.
I see.
So they don't really talk about Iraq being very violent against Yazidis after 1921, but definitely have very strong memories of Ottoman or Kurdish violence back in the 19th and early.
They do have?
They do, yes.
I see.
It's part of their vernacular traditions.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when we have like a massacre or a genocide, then we ask the question how it happened, right? So you can explain it with different things. So what are the potential, the theology, even, right? Or social hierarchy, whether the social hierarchy collapsed so that there was a resentment.
Yep.
Or some unpredictable, some unpredictable, unexpected things happen and then,
Yep.
My question is, if there's a kind of series of violence, like through a couple of centuries first, and each violence, each episode had a kind of a script, like people, some understanding, some evaluation, some assessment of this violence, and then some memory. And then 50 years later, another episode happened, and this script somehow can be carried out, and then it transformed into something else. All the scripts are pretty porous. I mean, they're not historical.
Yep.
For instance, in the first violence, theology might play a major role.
Yep.
Okay. In the second episode, like 30 years later, theology didn't play a role. But since that was a script before, so the theology was somewhere there still.
Yep.
So there's like accumulation of different factors, different symbols, different causalities. And some, again, like some might be forgotten, So how should we, like, as a kind of a political scientist or historian of this kind of like mass violence, how we methodologically approach this kind of continuity and the porous structure of the collective memory, jumping from one episode to another, the other episode to another.
I mean, yeah, so like from the Yazidi perspective, what they claim is that there have been 72 or 73 mass violence against the Yazidis.
Yeah.
But when you ask them, they can't really count 72, by the way. So just because, as you say, it's just very porous. And then their reading is that all of this violence was actually justified and motivated by religion. I mean, obviously, I don't take it as on face value because it's not the case, because I just give the example of how the Ottomans wanted to protect the caravans, and then they basically kind of really thought the Yazidis being bandits and they attacked them, not because they want to just exterminate them. But then again, as you just mentioned, then this basic self-perception became so central to the collective consciousness, which basically meant that when the IS violence took place back in 2014, their immediate reaction is that it's not something new. It's not something basically we encountered for the first time. It's just basically simply continuation of what happened to us for many centuries. Which is kind of interesting because it's a very cyclical understanding of history. We survive, we were attacked, we survive, and it basically goes on for a long time. I wasn't so surprised when I basically listened to that, because you may think that as an outsider, wow, this is just so, it's just so ferocious. You can't really think of something happening like that in the past, but no, from their perspective, they were very cynical, saying that we were always attacked through our history, and now this is basically last episode. I mean, as a scholar, you basically always approach these things with a critical mind, because but I kind of question that rhetoric always, because again, then you basically need to find some evidence. And my argument is that, so political resentment argument I basically insert is actually not going to be accepted by many Yazidis. Because from their perspective, we were infidels in the eyes of the Muslims, and they were basically just looking for opportunity to attack us. They are not going to talk about what happened in Iraq after post-2003. So you basically kind of find from other sources. You talk to people who basically look at Yazidi affairs, and usually basically come up with your own narrative. I mean, you kind of respect the survivors' testimonies, obviously, but at the same time, if I can use this word, like looking for truth, then you have to obviously also critical of that kind of testimonies. I mean, the limitation of my study is that I could not talk to perpetrators. So I could not basically ask them, why did they attack the Yazidis? Well, because of the circumstances. I mean, ideally, yes, you also want to talk to perpetrators because it gives you more maybe complicated picture. And if they say, yeah, because these people were infidels, they were murtads or whatever, they were evil worshippers, then you have more like a smoking gun evidence.
Or what they remember from the earlier.
Exactly, yes. Exactly, yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, so, but there's always a limit to what you can do in this kind of circumstances, obviously. Because most of my knowledge actually comes from talking to people who were attacked, not basically who committed violence. Unlike maybe people studying Rwanda or Bosnia and so on. So, yeah.
And the Kurdish, other Kurdish groups, you might know their.
I talked to lots of them, yes, and sometimes you get different perspectives. And Kurds have a very ambivalent relationship with the Yazidis because they're all Kurdish speaker. But then, again, Peshmerga did not protect them, so this is a big sense of betrayal among the Yazidis. But at the same time, they are really dependent on the Kurdish authorities because they stay in the camps. Camps are controlled by the Kurdish authorities. I mean, even as a researcher, it makes a big difference because let's say if you go to camp and if you have a Kurdish person with you as a translator, well, then it creates issues with the Yazidis because there are certain things they don't want to talk to the Kurdish person. And then they don't want to talk to basically if they perceive as being a Muslim. So, and you have to always think out all the time different complications, and it's understandable because of what their experience. So, yeah. I mean, and Kurdish authorities have maybe, again, like to their credit, they kind of try to run the camps, but they always have their own interests. I mean, they always want to be on the good graces of the Western authorities, and sometimes use Yazidis as an instrument to kind of saying, okay, there was a genocide against the Yazidis, but same thing happened to us under Saddam, the Anfal genocide. You need to support us because we can't live in this country, just support our independence type of rhetoric they use. So, yeah. And you have to navigate all this kind of complicated part as an outside researcher, so, yeah.
I can inform you about Baha'is in Iran in the beginning because I was there. You know, the Islamic regime killed some of the big Baha'is, but then they stopped because I knew some of the professors that elderly. Then they stopped their pension. Then they only those who had children abroad, like I know my friends, they had their children as a student in US, and those children needs to go and work extra to send money that they can survive.
Yep.
And Islamic regime for 1.5 years didn't have control in Iran.
Yes.
They killed as much as that they could, but they didn't have the control. And when they got the control, then Baha'is were just like elderly people.
Yep.
The young one has left.
Yep.
And Mujahideen, that was terroristic and blew the parliament, and communists were much more interesting for regime to kill. Baha'i were just bunch of old people.
And Baha'is are also typical political silent, which basically means that they typically avoid active politics, which also kind of did not really happen, but you're right, because once basically the regime establishes control, they completely discriminate against the Baha'is, but they did not also sponsor lots of big episodes of violence against them. But again, I mean, Baha'is are really marginalized in obviously Islamic Republic at the moment, so.
Because they had Iraq war, so much stuff.
Exactly, there were much more threats, yeah.
Communism, all those things.
Yeah, always other armed groups.
Baha'i was dying off by itself because they didn't get money.
Yeah.
It was very
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody for